The road to Cherryvale, Kansas was a lonely one. Endless stretches of dry grassland rolled beneath a sky too big, too empty. The only sounds were the rustling wind and the steady, unhurried beat of hooves against packed earth. Dr. William York sat tall in the saddle, his eyes fixed on the horizon, scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. He wasn't traveling for pleasure. He was searching for answers. A few months earlier, two men, his friends, the Longcore father and son, had vanished while making their way west. Their trail had led here and then simply stopped. No messages, no sightings, no bodies, just absence. Dr. York was a man of logic. A former Civil War surgeon, he had seen death in all its forms. He had pieced together broken soldiers, held men's hands as they gasped their last breaths, and carried the weight of too many final words. Death did not scare him. But something about this. Something about the way men simply disappeared along the Osage Trail. It gnawed at him, burrowing under his skin like a sickness he couldn't diagnose. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of a small roadside inn, a lonely little building nestled into the prairie. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Bender Inn and Groceries." It didn't look threatening, just another weary homestead, like so many others dotting the frontier. A place where travelers could rest, eat, and gather their strength before moving on. Dr. York dismounted, dusting off his coat. He had been here before, weeks earlier, while making his initial inquiries. The Benders had been polite, courteous even. They had claimed to know nothing about the missing men, but something about them had felt wrong. This time, he wasn't just asking questions. He intended to get answers. He stepped inside. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of stew bubbling over a fire. A wooden table stood at the center of the room, chairs neatly arranged around it. A large canvas curtain hung behind it, partially concealing another section of the cabin. Kate Bender, the young daughter, looked up from where she was setting plates. She smiled, a little too wide. Her dark eyes glinted in the lamplight. "Dr. York," she greeted, her voice smooth, almost melodic. "Back so soon?" He gave a polite nod, removing his hat. "I have unfinished business, Miss Bender." She tilted her head. "Still looking for your friends?" Dr. York studied her, noting the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. "Yes," he said, "and I intend to find them." Behind the counter, John Bender Sr. emerged from the back, his beard tangled and thick, his eyes shadowed beneath heavy brows. His wife, Almira, busied herself near the stove, avoiding York's gaze. "Sit," Kate offered, pulling out a chair. "You must be tired from the ride. Let me get you something warm." Dr. York hesitated. There was something unsettling about the way she watched him, but he was tired and hungry. He lowered himself into the chair, the wooden frame creaking under his weight. Kate set a bowl of steaming stew in front of him, smiling sweetly. "Eat," she urged. Dr. York picked up his spoon, hesitating only a moment before taking a bite. The flavors were rich, well-seasoned. He chewed slowly, listening. The Benders were silent, too silent. Then he heard it. A faint shuffle behind the curtain, the sound of movement, quick, deliberate, his muscles tensed. His instincts, owned from years of war and surgery, screamed at him. Something was wrong. He set his spoon down. "Who else is here?" Kate's smile never wavered. "Just family." He glanced toward the curtain. The movement had stopped. He could feel it. Someone was standing there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. His pulse quickened. He reached for his coat, fingers brushing against the revolver tucked inside. A chair leg scraped against the floor. John Bender Jr. appeared from the shadows, stepping into the light with an easy grin. "You seem nervous, Doctor," he said, voice thick with a German accent. "Something wrong?" Dr. York forced a smile. "Just tired, I suppose." John Jr. chuckled, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. His eyes flickered toward the curtain. Just for a second. A silent signal. Dr. York understood, and he knew. If he didn't leave now, he never would. He pushed his chair back, standing abruptly. "I should be going. Long ride ahead of me." Kate's smile faltered. "So soon?" Dr. York nodded, forcing himself to move calmly, to not betray the rising panic in his chest. He turned toward the door. He had taken 3 steps when the world shattered. A sharp explosion of pain. Stars burst behind his eyes. The floor rushed up to meet him. The last thing Dr. York saw was the edge of the curtain, swaying gently, and the glint of something metal, a knife, catching the lamplight. Then, darkness. Dr. William York had found his answer, but no one would ever hear it. And outside, The wind carried on, sweeping across the empty plains, erasing his final cries into the endless Kansas night. On the surface, they looked like any other homesteading family. Hardworking, quiet, simple folk trying to carve out a living on the unforgiving Kansas frontier. But the Benders were not simple folk. They were something else entirely. At the head of the family was John Bender Sr., a towering, hulking man with deep-set eyes and a thick, unkempt beard. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were a guttural mess, thick with a German accent so heavy that most couldn't understand him. Those who did catch his words wished they hadn't. His wife, Almira Bender, was no softer. Hard-eyed and bitter-faced, locals whispered that she was a witch, that her strange, guttural mutterings were curses in disguise. She never smiled, never laughed. Then there was John Bender Jr., their so-called son, younger, clean-shaven, and always grinning. But his smile never reached his eyes. He had an odd way about him, his laughter too loud, his jokes too strange, often drifting into eerie, rambling nonsense. Some said he wasn't right in the head. And finally, Kate Bender. Kate was different, charming, beautiful. Unlike the others, she was warm and inviting, her dark eyes filled with intelligence. She spoke English fluently, unlike her father and mother, and she had a gift, one that made her the perfect bait. Kate claimed to be a healer, a spiritualist, a psychic. She promised she could talk to the dead, see into the future, cure illnesses with just the touch of her hands. And on the frontier, where life was uncertain and death was constant, people listened. Men, in particular, listened. She would advertise her abilities, offering seances and spiritual healing. Some came out of curiosity, others out of desperation, and some never left. "Let me read your fortune," she would say, taking a traveler's hands in hers. "I can see things no one else can." She played the part well, warm, welcoming. She would invite travelers inside, offering them food, a place to rest. The weary ones, tired from the road, would accept, and that was their mistake. The Benders' Inn was simple, a single-room cabin, sparsely furnished. A long wooden table sat at its center where guests would eat. But there was something strange about the way the room was arranged. The table's main seat, the one reserved for guests, was positioned directly in front of a thick canvas curtain that hung from the ceiling, dividing the room. It seemed unremarkable. Just a simple partition separating the public space from their sleeping quarters. But behind that curtain, hidden from view, was a small, darkened chamber. And in that chamber, someone was always waiting. A guest would take their seat at the table, laughing, chatting, unaware. And behind that curtain, one of the Bender men would be standing, gripping a sledgehammer in his hands, his breath slow, patient, waiting for the moment Kate gave the signal. And when she did, the victim would never even know what hit them. The Benders would waste no time. The body would be stripped of valuables, the throat cut to ensure death, and then dumped through a hidden trapdoor beneath the table. That trapdoor led to the cellar, and the cellar was a slaughterhouse. Blood coated the walls, soaked into the dirt floor. It was a graveyard beneath their feet, a hidden abyss where the unfortunate souls of the Osage Trail were discarded like garbage. And the next morning, the Benders would carry on as if nothing had happened. John Jr. would be out in the fields tending to the horses. Almira would be inside, cooking breakfast. Kate would be smiling, greeting the next weary traveler who wandered up the road. And just beyond the house, in the small orchard behind the inn, fresh dirt would be piled over another shallow grave. Another missing man, another mystery, another secret buried beneath the Kansas sun. But secrets, no matter how deep you bury them, have a way of clawing back to the surface. And soon, the Benders' secrets would be unearthed. At first, no one noticed the disappearances. The Osage Trail was a dangerous road, a gateway to the untamed West. Bandits roamed the land, accidents happened, travelers vanished all the time. It was expected. But then, people started asking questions. A farmer's neighbor never made it home. A traveling salesman failed to send word to his family. A preacher, a gold prospector, a weary settler, one by one, they simply disappeared. Most shrugged it off. The frontier was unforgiving. If a man went missing, it was likely the work of outlaws, or maybe the land itself swallowed him whole. But then Dr. William York vanished. And that changed everything. To the citizens of Labette County, my brother, Dr. William York, is missing. I will not rest until I find out what happened to him. The words belonged to Colonel Ed York, A man of status, a man of means, and most importantly, a man who did not believe in coincidence. York was no ordinary traveler. He came from a powerful family, and when he set out to find his missing brother, he did not ride alone. He brought a posse, and he was not the only one searching. Word spread, more and more families came forward, their voices trembling as they spoke of missing fathers, brothers, sons. A growing list of names, too many to ignore. Something was happening along the Osage Trail. Something was wrong. And then, someone mentioned the Benders. At first, it was just a whisper. A murmur passed between wary townsfolk. The Bender family, they were strange, odd, too quiet, too polite. Their farm sat right along the path where men had gone missing, and yet they never spoke of seeing travelers. Then there was Kate Bender. Her unsettling charm, the way men seemed drawn to her, the way she always knew things. "I saw him go in," a merchant in town admitted, speaking of one of the missing men. "Never saw him come out." The pieces were coming together. Too many coincidences, too many missing travelers, and soon, too many questions. One day, Colonel York himself rode to the Bender Inn, and when the door creaked open, he was met with Kate's smile. "Why, Colonel York, what a pleasure. What brings you all the way out here?" Something was wrong with this place. He could feel it, and he intended to find out why. Colonel York stepped inside. Kate Bender watched him carefully for her dark eyes filled with something unreadable. Behind her, John Bender Sr. leaned against the walls, silent. Almira stirred a pot over the fire, her back turned. John Jr. sat at the table, smiling. But there was something unnatural about it, something forced. York was a man who had spent years on battlefields, facing death in 1,000 different ways. And yet, as he stood in that cabin, he felt something crawl over his skin, something invisible but undeniable. It was the feeling a man gets when he knows he's being watched. "Please," she purred, "make yourself comfortable." York didn't sit. Instead, he glanced around. The room was small, just one large space, divided by a thick, heavy canvas curtain. A long wooden table stood at its center, its main chair positioned directly in front of that curtain. Something about that arrangement unsettled him. "We heard about your brother," Kate continued, her voice smooth, dripping with honeyed sympathy. "Such a tragedy. But the frontier's dangerous. Many men go missing." York didn't answer. He just studied her. She didn't flinch under his gaze. If anything, she seemed to enjoy it. "You must be hungry," Kate said. "Eat. Rest. Stay the night if you like." It was an innocent offer. Too innocent. York wasn't a fool. He had spoken to townsfolk. He had heard the whispers. He had heard how many men had disappeared after passing through this place. He had also heard something else, something chilling. A merchant had told him that a traveler, a man named George Longcore, had been seen entering the Bender Inn weeks ago. No one had seen him since. And now, standing there, York thought of that man. He thought of the others. He thought of his brother. Then he spoke. "Several men have gone missing along this trail," he said, his eyes never leaving Kate's, "and all of them were last seen near this inn." Behind Kate, John Bender Sr. stirred. Almira's spoon paused in the bowl. John Jr.'s grin faltered for just a fraction of a second. Then, Kate laughed. "Are you accusing us of something, Colonel?" "I'm not accusing anyone," he said. "Not yet." The room was silent. And then Kate's expression shifted. The warmth drained from her eyes. The mask slipped, just for a heartbeat. And for the first time, Colonel York saw it. Not charm, not hospitality. Something else. Something cold. Something hungry. Colonel York didn't stay for dinner. He didn't sit. He didn't drink. He didn't eat. He left that house with his hand resting on the hilt of his pistol, his mind filled with unease. And when he mounted his horse and rode back to town, he made himself a promise. He would return. And when he did, he would not be alone. Because she knew time was running out. For all of them. Colonel York left, but the Benders knew he would return. And when he did, he would not come alone. Inside the cabin, the Bender family sat in silence, their expressions grim. John Sr.'s hands clenched into fists. Almira's lips pressed into a thin line. John Jr. rocked slightly in his seat, his grin nowhere to be found. And Kate? Kate Bender knew this day would come. Her charm had worked for a long time. The travelers had been easy prey. The frontier was lawless, wild. Missing men were forgotten, and their secrets were buried beneath orchard soil. But Colonel York was not just another traveler. He was dangerous. "We leave," she said, her voice calm. "Tonight." No one argued. They moved quickly, methodically, like they had planned for this moment. They had no intention of facing the law, no intention of answering for what they had done. They would vanish, just as their victims had. Under the cover of darkness, the Bender family fled. By morning, the Bender Inn stood empty, deserted, silent, and the only thing they left behind was death. It would take weeks before anyone realized they were gone, but when they did, that was when the real horror began. Days passed, then weeks. No one saw the Benders again. But their absence did not bring relief. It brought questions. Colonel York kept his promise. He returned with armed men, lawmen, townsfolk, anyone who had lost someone along the Osage Trail. And this time, the Benders were not there to greet them. The inn was empty. The fire had long since burned out. The beds remained untouched. But something felt wrong. Then they noticed the chair, the one at the head of the table. It was positioned directly in front of the curtain, facing it. A chill passed through the men as they exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the stories, the rumors. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to find. And then, they saw it. A trapdoor, right beneath the chair. What lay beneath was darkness. A hole. A pit. And the stench that rose from it was thick, cloying, suffocating. It was the stench of death. And there, beneath the floorboards, lay the first of many bodies. Their throats had been slit from ear to ear. Their skulls caved in with a single brutal blow. Some bodies had begun to rot, melting into the dirt, while others were still fresh enough that the search party could recognize their faces. One of them was Dr. William York. The truth was undeniable now. The Benders had not been grocers. They had not been hosts. They had been butchers. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. Because outside, the orchard waited, and beneath its roots, there were more graves to be found. The trapdoor was just the start. The pit beneath the Bender Inn had held bodies, yes, but there were only a few, and yet so many more had gone missing. That was when someone noticed it. The earth, it was different here. Darker, looser, disturbed. And then, the first grave was uncovered. The search party held its breath as they dug deeper, their hands shaking as they pulled away the dirt, revealing what lay beneath. A body, then another, and another, and another. The orchard was not an orchard, it was a graveyard. At least a dozen corpses were pulled from the shallow pits, their skulls caved in, their throats slashed. Most had been travelers, men carrying gold, letters, belongings that marked them as people who had families waiting for them, waiting for answers. One of the men found a letter. A half-written note never sent. It was from a man to his wife. It spoke of a long journey, of exhaustion, of relief when he found a welcoming little inn along the trail. He had never made it home. None of them had. This was not the work of outlaws. This was not an accident. The Benders had been hunting for years, and now they were gone. There would be no justice for the dead, no trials, no hangings, no vengeance, only the wind and the weight of the truth. The Bender farm had become something else now, a place of death, a place of ghosts, and though the Benders had disappeared, their sins still lingered. The Benders had vanished. They had not packed their belongings. They had not sold their land. They had simply disappeared, as if the prairie itself had swallowed them whole. A posse was formed, lawmen, townsfolk, soldiers. They scoured the trails, following every rumor, every whisper of a sighting. Some said they had fled south, slipping into the wild lands of Oklahoma Territory. Others believed they had split apart, John and Elmira going one way, Kate and John Jr. another, scattering like shadows in the wind. And then there were the darker theories. Some claimed the Benders never made it out of Kansas, that vigilantes had found them first, that justice had come, not in the form of a trial, but in the cold grip of a noose. No graves, no records, no proof, only whispers. But whether they escaped or whether they perished in the shadows, one thing was certain: the legend of the Benders would never die, because some ghosts do not rest, and some monsters never truly vanish. The Benders may have disappeared from history, but their story, their legacy, was just beginning. The Benders, America's first serial killer family. Those words would haunt towns for years to come. The Benders had become more than just killers. They had become a myth, a warning, a symbol of the terrifying truth that even the most ordinary-looking people could hide the darkest of secrets. Towns that had once welcomed the Benders now lived in fear of the unknown. Other families turned their land into graveyards, unwilling to rest until they found their own answer. But for every trace the lawmen followed, every shadow cast in the wrong direction, the truth seemed to slip further into the dark. Some say the Benders did find justice in the end. Some say they died in a lonely, forgotten corner of the world, too scared to speak, too lost to ever be found. Others believe they found refuge in the chaos of the frontier, starting over somewhere else, disappearing into the cracks of history. But perhaps the most chilling possibility is that the Benders never really left at all. Perhaps they are still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to wander too close to the edge of the prairie. The Benders may be gone, but their legacy lives on, in the whispers of the wind, in the shadows that stretch long over the land, and in the hearts of those who still fear what they left behind. The story of the Benders, like so many tales of darkness and despair, has slipped through the cracks of time, fading into the forgotten corners of history. But that doesn't make it any less real. The Bender family left behind a trail of victims and a legacy of terror. They showed us that the most dangerous monsters aren't always the ones that wear a mask or growl in the night. Sometimes, they're the ones who invite us in. What happened to the Benders may never be fully known. But what we do know is that their story still echoes. And in every corner of this land, it waits to be uncovered. The truth of their crimes lies hidden, like so many dark secrets that have yet to be unearthed. But as long as we remember, as long as we ask the hard questions, we'll keep searching. What are the Benders' true legacy? The victims' names, their lives? Are they forever lost to the wind? Or can we still bring the truth to light? We may never know for sure. But one thing is certain. This is not the end of their story. If you found the tale of the Benders haunting, leave a comment below. What do you think happened to them? Could they have escaped? Or did their own dark fate finally catch up with them? Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling historical stories and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a twisted tale from the past. Because sometimes, the past is never truly gone.